do we know the casualty numbers in Ukraine?
No,
In,
we don't.
well,
um,
why is that? Is that typical during a war that we don't know what the numbers are?
um, well, it's maybe okay. I think at least for one side, I believe like during the Vietnam War, actually in the U.S. wars, we have the U.S. government. I think to its credit, has been very transparent about casualties and the number of killed. I remember that was something like a daily report during the Vietnam War, and as those casualty figures rose, support for the war declined. But the Russians have chosen not to publish their own casualty figures, and the Ukrainians too. Um, the Russians do publish their estimated casualties, killed and seriously wounded of the Ukrainians, and I think they're probably pretty accurate. They, I, there is one outfit. It's the Mediazona project, which I know we've mentioned several times. It's the only one that seems to have a rigorous methodology and for measuring the number of Russian killed in the conflict. And what they do is that they just scour the web and cemeteries, and they for any and find those who are reported as being killed in the war that way. And they've been doing that since pretty much the beginning of the conflict. Um, um, they say, well, they're pretty sure that there's more than that, but they figure maybe it's 20% more. Who knows? It's close to the accurate um, death count for the Russians. And the last I checked, they were somewhere under 100,000, like 80,000 or something killed, which is significant, but it's way less than what like the Ukrainians claim or most Western outfits claim. Um, and the important thing about that is that you can be absolutely confident because they're using the same methodology throughout. So you can look at trends, right? You can compare the data over time. Um, and if you do that, you see that there were a couple of peaks there initially, like in the first month or two of the war, there were a high number of Russian casualties. I think this because the Russians um, invaded. They entered Ukrainian territory, and I think they probably did underestimate like the Ukrainian strength. And a lot of these convoys, Russian convoys, were ambushed, and there were fairly heavy casualties. Then the second peak is in Bakhmut, which is and that of course was Prigozhin's Wagner group, and it was successful, but the casualties were high. I think the tactics that they used. Again, you have to say they were successful, but at a considerable cost to the Russians. And then there was a third, actually much smaller peak in last year, when, or maybe no, it was more like the end of 2023, when the attack on Avdiivka began. Some of the initial assaults were again successful, but the Russians paid a fairly heavy price. Nothing as bad as Bakhmut or the first month of the war. But then since then, like the number of casualties, number of killed, as measured, consistently by Mediazona, has been dropping. So now we're down like the lowest that we've seen in the whole war. And this is happening while the Russians are advancing faster than they ever advanced. So that's really quite remarkable. I mean, that's a very encouraging statistic for the Russians, and it should be a very disturbing one for the Ukrainians. Now, we can use that as sort of like a benchmark. Let's say there are 100,000 Russian killed. I think that's probably pretty close. Maybe less than that, maybe possibly a little more, but it should be around there. I think Mediazona is the best figures that we have to go by.
Mm.
Um,
Could you,
now,
Dad?
go ahead.
Could you turn off the AC? Okay, where were we?
Okay, so I was just saying. Okay, yeah. The question is how many Ukrainian casualties there are, right?
Mm.
Now, normally in a war, the offense suffers more heavy casualties than the defense, all things being equal. And it's obvious. You think about it, like, when the Russians are attacking a fortified position, let's say a trench held by the Ukrainians, they have to rush across the field, go out in the open, and the Ukrainians are in a trench. You can fire from there. So just in general, again, all things being everything else being equal, the defenders have the advantage and are going to suffer fewer casualties than the attackers. And the Russians have been on the offense for better than a year now, quite clearly. So you think maybe Russian casualties should be heavier than Ukrainian casualties, but I don't think so. I think it's the opposite. And the reason is that things, all other things are not equal. We're close to equal. The Russians have a huge advantage in artillery. I think the Ukrainians themselves have admitted that it's something 10 to 1. And the artillery historically has been the number one killer and wounder of troops in war. It's been in past wars, it's been about 80%. And I think we found that it's similar in this war too. So I imagine that drones are starting to eat into that. And with the Russians with a 10 to 1 advantage, are going to inflict many more casualties on the Ukrainians than the other way around. And the other thing is, then the Russians have this air superiority and their guided glide bombs, the FABs, and they started using these roughly a year ago, and have been using them extensively ever since to devastating effect. And now the Russians also have an advantage, a significant advantage in drones, which is a big killer in the war. So in all these areas, they're ahead, and some of them, like, the air superiority is pretty much absolute. They have the FABs, and again, these are 500, 1,000, up to 3,000 kilo bombs that just, completely pulverize fortifications. So being a defender is not so much of an advantage anymore. That advantage has been neutralized by the advantages that the Russians have. So now, instead of having to, just to rush across a field and storm a trench that's, well defended, and, inevitably you're going to suffer many casualties in the process, they can sit back. This is what they do. They pound it with artillery for days. They send a couple of those glide bombs in. They're patrolling the area with their drones, and mapping everything out. And every time a poor Ukrainian soldier goes out in the woods to take a dump, they take him out with a drone. So they get to when they're convinced that the Ukrainians, the forces have been attrited, down to a level where they really can't defend themselves anymore, then they go after them. And now they don't do it. They used to go in these infantry fighting vehicles or tanks. And that's not the way that usually storm a trench or a fortification anymore. They actually get on electric motorbikes, and they don't go in a straight line. They come in from many different directions and attack at once. And that makes things much more difficult for the Ukrainians. This is what the Ukrainians themselves say. It used to be that you see maybe a column of armored vehicles heading your way, and then you just take out the whole column or half of it, and inflict very serious casualties, because there's maybe in each one of these vehicles there might be 10 soldiers or 8 soldiers or something, and many of them will be killed and wounded. But now you got these 10 guys on motorbikes, and they're all going down different paths. At best you'll take out one, and you probably won't even do that because they're small, fast-moving targets. And so that's it's through these tactics, but then also this overwhelming advantage in weaponry that the Russians are able to completely eliminate the historic disadvantage to the attacker, and have actually reversed it. And so I think it's just it's the logical conclusion is that the Ukrainians are suffering much heavier casualties than the Russians are. What it is, it's hard to say. It could be something like, I think it was who was it that recently said 900,000 killed and wounded?
On the Ukrainian side.
On the Ukrainian side, right? I think Putin himself estimated 5 to 1. So if that's the case, we may be looking at 500,000 killed Ukrainians. That would be my guess. Another bit of evidence that we have is actually whenever there's an exchange of dead bodies on the two sides. Well, it used to be something like, I think the average over last year was something like 8 to 1. Like there were 8 Ukrainian dead bodies to every one Russian, but now it's gone up above 10 to 1. Now, so many people have pointed out that may be, at least I think, is partly explained by the fact that the Russians are advancing. So let's say there's a fight, there are dead bodies on the field, the Russians advance, they're more likely to catch the dead bodies, collect the dead bodies. So I think that would explain it, but it still suggests that there is, a definite ratio against the Ukrainians. So maybe it's not 10 to 1, probably it's more like 5 to 1. That's again, it's just a guess. Nobody really knows for sure.
Right. Do you think we will ever know the exact numbers? Because when I look at historical battles, if I go on Wikipedia or open up a history book, I can see a battle and there'll be very precise numbers that there'll be in this battle, there were 73,422 people to the number, it'll say, and I just feel like in today's day and age, we have a lot more data. It should be able to be reflected in real time. But the fact that it isn't just leaves it open to complete interpretation.
Right.
And I feel like there's a tendency now that we can't even trust the data. Like, is it going to be corrupted to fit a narrative?
Yeah. Right. Well, again, we can, we do have media, so that's something. But and obviously the Ukrainians have taken advantage of this because this is something you find again and again. I mean, when you're reading for example, there may be an article in a major news outlet, let's say the New York Times or Financial Times, that does admit that the Ukrainians are in a real fix and that they're retreating. But then always at some point, but of course the Russian casualties are much higher. I mean, this is what they they always throw in there. Now, there's really no basis for that. It's just what the Ukrainians are saying. So it allows the Ukrainians to if they're not able to completely frame the narrative because the reality is so obviously bad for them on the battlefield, they can still color and spin it. And that's what happens. So people still say, well, yeah, the Ukrainians are doing bad, but the Russians are probably on the point of collapse. Now, the thing is, like, if there really was, like, the kind of casualties on the Russian side that we're being told, I think you would see some evidence of that within Russia. You would see like what we see here, in Ukraine. It seems like every other week I see something about a new Ukrainian cemetery, where the newly, with rows and rows and rows of new graves. And you just don't see any. It's not, Russia is not a totalitarian society. People are free to go out and take pictures and post them, and it's just not there. I mean, so there have been casualties. There may be 100,000, which is really quite significant, but it's not at the level, where the individual families have suffered and obviously these tragedies, but it's not something that affects society as a whole. It's still. Something that's kind of on the edges. You may be, I've heard in Ukraine, it's just like everybody knows somebody that's died. I don't know, that statistics, it was something like a third during the first year, but now it's well over a half. Well, everybody knows at least somebody closely related or a friend that's died, and it's gone. And I think this may have been a whole year ago, but it's like the average number of people that they knew that had died was 6. So that's clearly Ukrainian society has been has suffered a very severe impact. That's just not true of Russia. I mean, you should be able to find evidence of it if the Ukrainian claims are correct, and you just don't find that evidence of those kind of losses within Russian society.
Do you think after this war is over, we will have a proper accounting that the
I think
Ukrainian
we may.
government?
Yeah, I think we may.
Do you think the
Yeah.
U.S. government knows how many Ukrainians have died?
It's hard to say. Again, like I've always said, and I believe that there are honest analysts, within our intelligence agencies. But it seems clear to me that the agencies have been corrupted. It's uh, it's you could say the bootlickers have risen to the top, the ones that have learned that you tell the guy upstairs what he wants to hear, and so I think we have that you know problem, and then there's the fact that we have these very very tight links with Ukrainian intelligence, and it looks like we simply outsourced a lot of intelligence gathering to them, which means that they just feed us lies, so if lies that are fed into our intelligence agencies and then are passed up to the decision makers.
Yeah, I hope it all comes to light when this is out. It's something that I think is very important, and it's something
Yeah,
that
no, I think it is.
right. I'm just thinking about how history will look back on this. If we take a look at one of these battles, and then we take a look at this war, and we see the casualties, something like 100,000 on Russia's side, and something that could be like 700,000 on the Ukrainian side. It's just going to be hard to wash that stain. Like, how stupid was this war? You look at Russia, just look at the map. It's massive. Plus, you're saying like it's being viewed as the invading country. We can debate on that. We use the referendums or whatever. But if they were moving in to Ukraine, they should have suffered heavier losses, like you say, as an invading country. And then they're backed by NATO, the most powerful fighting force in the whole world, pumping all their money. And then you just look at the end result of this war, what we have. How can we live that down to say and we had to be conscious that we just sacrificed all these people, and we were pressing them to lower the conscription age because they're running out of men. And you just see these casualty numbers when they come out. If it's truly something like 5-1, 8-1, who knows? Hopefully it comes out. What kind of repercussions does that have for the U.S.? Wouldn't our reputation be completely ruined? If you're a country like Taiwan, you'd be like, yeah, they want us to go to war against China now? I mean, like, what is this?
Yeah, right. Well, I mean, it should, but we have been involved in disasters in the past. Let's not forget, for example, that the economic sanctions on Iraq caused the deaths of hundreds of thousands of children, hundreds of thousands of adults, and directly attributable to the U.S.-led sanctions. They were imposed by the United Nations. The problem is, like, when the United Nations actually passes a resolution, it's just permanent unless all 5 of the Security Council members vote to revoke it. And so, there were noises afterwards, I believe, from the Russians and the Chinese about it. They were as convinced to go along with this. But then when they saw what was happening, they weren't so sure. But the Americans refused to lift the sanctions. And you had, was it Madeleine Albright? She was actually directly about it. You said 500,000 Iraqi children dead. And she says, well, sometimes you have to pay the price. This is a horrible thing. Look, this is, what can you say? But it got a little bit of play in the press, but it's just been, the narrative goes on, and America is still the most virtuous country in the world. And so I'm afraid that, it is a black mark on the U.S., but within the U.S. and within its Western allies, it really may not have as much effect as we would like it to have.
Right. I just feel like it would have a different impact as this was a European country. Mm-hmm. That this is something that
it's closer to home. That's
right.
True.
Germany and France and UK, everybody's watching this so closely, and they're being fed this narrative about, Russians fighting the Ukrainians with shovels and throwing them into, using human wave tactics. And then when it comes out later that it's undeniable, if we see the casualty numbers, that like, what were we doing? What was this? I just feel like it would have to
well, let's hope
cause
so,
some repercussions.
But again, it's just like the Western propaganda is disturbingly effective, and they are very good at suppressing, inconvenient truths.